Somewhere in the English countryside, there is a barn that has stood for more than 700 years. 7 centuries of storms, wet winters, and the whole frame swelling and shrinking with every season it has ever lived through. And the joints that hold it up are as tight today as the afternoon they were raised. No steel brackets, no bolts, not a single nail anywhere in the frame. Now think about your own house. The floor that squeaks in the same 3 spots, the nail head that has slowly pushed its way out through the drywall, the deck that felt solid for a decade and then started to wobble. Your house went up in a few days, built by a crew with nail guns, engineered hangers, and galvanized everything. That barn was built by one man with a chisel, an auger, and a handful of wooden pegs. So how did the method that lasts the better part of 1,000 years get quietly dropped from almost every building site on the planet? Why does a frame put together with cheap steel keep failing, while a frame put together with shaped wood just refuses to die? This is the story of the joint we were taught to replace with a nail gun and the very simple reason it still beats it. This story doesn't start in that barn. It starts with a freshly felled oak tree and the one problem every builder who has ever lived has had to deal with. Wood never stops moving. Almost nobody outside the trade really understands timber. A piece of wood is never truly finished. It takes on moisture in a damp winter and swells. It dries in a hot summer and shrinks back. It does this a little every single year for as long as the building stands. Pin it down rigid and it does not stop moving. It just tears at whatever you use to hold it in place. The squeak in your floorboards and the nail working its way out of your wall are the same phenomenon. A house quietly fighting the wood it is made of and slowly losing the fight. The medieval carpenter understood that movement long before anyone could measure it. And instead of fighting it, he put it to work. He built with green oak, not the dried, seasoned, kiln-baked lumber you would buy today, but timber cut fresh and still wet from the living tree. Green oak is far softer, and a chisel cuts it cleanly, so every joint could be shaped by hand without a fight. Then slowly, over years inside the finished building, that wet timber dried out. And as it dried, it shrank. Here is the strange part. The joints did not loosen as the frame aged. They pulled themselves tighter. The building was at its weakest the day it was raised, and it spent the next several centuries quietly getting stronger. The joint itself is where the real craft lived. Where 2 timbers met, the carpenter cut a tongue on the end of one, called a tenon, and a matching slot in the other, called a mortise. The tenon slid into the slot. A single hole was bored straight through both, and an oak peg was driven home to lock them together. No glue, no metal, just wood gripping wood. And these frames were not even built where they stand. The whole thing was cut and fitted flat on the ground, every timber scratched with a carpenter's mark so the puzzle could be taken apart, hauled to the site, hoisted up, and pegged back together in the right order. But the part that still impresses structural engineers today is a trick called draw boring. Before driving the peg, the carpenter deliberately bored the hole through the tenon, slightly out of line with the holes through the mortise, offset by something like a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch. So when he drove a tapered peg through all 3, the peg could not run straight. It had to bend, and as it bent, it hauled the tenon hard into the slot and clamped the entire joint shut. No clamps, no waiting on glue to cure. One peg, and the joint was locked tight in a single blow. Now remember that the timber is going to keep shrinking for years. In a drawboard joint, that bent peg sits there like a loaded spring, and as the wood shrinks around it, the spring keeps pulling the joint closed. A carpenter could walk back in 200 years later, tap the same peg a fraction deeper, and tighten the whole frame all over again. There is documented evidence of English builders using this by the 13th century, and it is almost certainly far older than that. This is the part that still doesn't quite make sense to modern builders. A joint cut entirely by hand that tightens itself for centuries and asks for nothing in return. So why no nails, no iron, no metal of any kind in the structure? Part of it was cost. Iron was genuinely expensive in the medieval world, but the deeper reason is that metal and wood are bad long-term partners, and the old builders had generations of failures to learn from. Drive a piece of steel into timber, and you create two problems at the same time. The steel rusts, especially anywhere the wood ever gets damp, and the seam between the metal and the wood traps moisture against the grain, which is exactly where rot likes to begin, so the wood starts to rot right around the fastener that is supposed to be holding it. Galvanizing, that zinc coating on modern nails and joist hangers, slows the rust down. It does not stop it. Mix two different metals in a damp joint, a bare steel nail sitting next to a zinc-coated bracket, and they can actually corrode each other faster. A quiet electrochemical reaction eating the fasteners from the inside out. And the moment a fastener loosens its grip even slightly, the whole frame loses its stiffness and starts to rack and creak. A wooden peg has none of those weaknesses. It cannot rust. It expands and contracts at the same rate as the oak around it, so it never works itself loose the way a rigid steel nail does. And if it ever does fail, it fails at the same slow pace as the rest of the wood, not decades ahead of it. One joint, quietly beating both of the real enemies a wooden building actually faces: the movement and the moisture. For a long time you could file all of this under happy accident. Maybe those old frames survived in spite of how they were built, not because of it. Except people have gone and checked. Cross the Atlantic to Dedham, Massachusetts, and you will find the Fairbanks House, the oldest timber frame house still standing in all of North America. Its main oak beam has been dated by its own tree rings to a tree felled in 1637. It was built by colonists using the old world method they had carried across the ocean in their heads. The frame is oak, cut and used green. It is held together with wooden pegs the builders called tree nails, and there is not one iron nail in the structure. Why not? Because, as the people who study the house put it plainly, iron nails rusted and loosened over time, while the green wood, as it dried, shrank and bound the whole frame together instead. That house has stood for the better part of 400 years, and you can walk through it today. And that is just the New World. Back in England and across Europe, oak frames raised between roughly 1200 and 1700 are still lived in and worked in right now. Greenstead Church in Essex has oak in its walls older than that again, closing in on 1,000 years. The leaning Tudor halls of Cheshire are still standing despite looking like a stiff wind should finish them. Whole towns across Germany are still arranged around streets of half-timbered houses from the same centuries, their dark oak frames and pale infill panels sitting there exactly as they looked when the carpenters packed up and walked away. There is a reason carpenters still travel across countries just to study these buildings, and the clearest proof of the whole idea is in Japan, where wooden pagodas built with the same flexible joinery have ridden out earthquakes and typhoons for 6, 7, even 14 centuries, because the joints bend and shift instead of snapping. This was never primitive guesswork. The physics underneath it is simply correct. Let the wood move, lock it with wood, and keep the metal out. Do that, and the building does not so much resist time as ignore it. Which raises the obvious question. If this method is this good, why is almost nobody alive still building this way? And the answer is almost cruel. The very thing that made these frames last, the fact that cutting them took a master carpenter years to learn, was the exact thing that killed the craft. If timber joinery had stayed the standard right here, this would be a very different story. The turning point came in the 1830s in a fast-growing Chicago. Two things that had always been expensive suddenly got cheap, almost overnight. Machine-cut lumber, milled to identical sizes, and machine-made nails stamped out by the keg. For the first time in history, a builder could buy a stack of standard boards and a bucket of cheap nails and simply nail a house together. And this is the detail that usually gets lost. In a heavy timber frame, the joinery was never decoration. A nail driven into a massive post and beam would just pull straight back out under the weight of the building, which is the whole reason the mortise and tenon existed in the first place. It was structure, not style. The balloon frame sidestepped that problem entirely by spreading the load of the house across dozens of thin, closely spaced studs, so that no single connection ever had to carry very much, and a handful of nails was suddenly strong enough. The pegged joint was never beaten on durability. It was simply made unnecessary by a lighter, cheaper way of standing a wall up. They called the new method balloon framing, and it rewrote the entire trade. A traditional oak frame needed a master carpenter and months of skilled handwork cutting joints one at a time. A balloon frame needed 2 ordinary workers, basic tools, and a few weeks. Lumber in America was everywhere. Skilled carpenters were not. So the math was brutal and simple. The established timber framers mocked the flimsy new stick houses, joking they were so light they might float away like a balloon, which is exactly where the name stuck. They lost the argument anyway. By the 1880s, nailing 2x4s together was the standard way to build in America, and the platform framing version of it still is today. The wooden boring machines carpenters had used for centuries to drill peg holes became obsolete almost overnight. You would think someone would have stood up and fought to save the older craft. Almost nobody did. And here is the part that should bother you, because the old method never actually became illegal. Open the building code today, and heavy timber is still in there as a completely legal way to build. It even gets its own category, with fire resistance ratings that beat ordinary stick framing. So why does practically every new house still go up as nailed 2x4s? Because the code quietly steers everyone there without banning a thing. For conventional stick framing, the code hands the builder a cookbook, prescriptive tables that say, use this nail, space the studs this far apart, done, no engineer required. Traditional timber joinery is not in those tables. So to build a real pegged frame, you usually have to hire a structural engineer to stamp the drawings, then convince a local inspector who has very likely never seen a drawboard tenon in his life. And when a plan looks unfamiliar, the safe answer for everyone involved is no. On top of that, a full hand-cut joinery frame takes 2 to 3 times longer to cut than slapping on metal connectors. If you are wondering how the better method ended up being the harder, more expensive, paperwork-heavy one, so is everyone who has ever tried to build this way. Nobody had to ban it. The default did all the work a ban never could. All of this is really one small piece of a much bigger thing. The medieval world ran on hard, practical, hands-on knowledge that mostly never got written down, and an enormous amount of it we very nearly lost for good. That is exactly why we put the methods and recipes we have managed to dig back up into the guides over at the Medieval Way store from the Medieval Bakery. Practical recipes to the sourdough manual and the sourcing guide. If the timber hall is your kind of thing, the medieval kitchen belongs right next to it. The link is waiting below. Now, back to the wood. None of this makes modern framing the villain, and the version of this story where nailed houses are simply garbage is not the full picture. A stick-framed house goes up fast, costs a fraction of a hand-cut frame, and has put a solid roof over hundreds of millions of people who could never in a lifetime have afforded a master carpenter and a year of work. That is a real achievement. What got lost in the trade was not quality so much as a choice. We did not forget how the pegged joint works. We simply stopped offering it. One answer quietly became the only answer, and a craft that produced buildings lasting half a millennium got quietly filed away as something for restoration specialists and weekend hobbyists. So what do you actually do with this, whether you are planning to build something or you just never want to look at a nailed joint the same way again? Start with the version anyone can use, because you do not need a timber frame house to use the idea. The next time you build anything that genuinely has to last, a garden gate, a workbench, a heavy door, a solid bench, join it with a drawboard mortise and tenon instead of screws and brackets. Cut the tenon, cut the mortise, bore the peg hole through the tenon about 1/8 of an inch off from the holes in the mortise, and drive a tapered hardwood peg straight through. No glue needed. The offset pulls it tight and keeps it tight, and years down the line you can tap the peg deeper and renew the joint by hand. It will outlast anything you could have screwed together, and it costs you a scrap of wood. If you are building something bigger and you want the full method, it is genuinely on the table. Plenty of timber framers still cut traditional joinery for a living, and a porch, a pavilion, a barn, or even a whole frame home can be raised with pegged oak instead of metal connectors. Ask specifically for drawboard pegged joints, not hidden steel pretending to be joinery, and let the frame stay exposed where you can, so the wood can breathe and dry out rather than getting sealed up damp against steel. And whatever you end up building, steal the underlying principle even if you never cut a single joint in your life. Keep your structural wood up out of standing water, keep metal fasteners out of any joint that tends to stay damp, and let the timber move instead of pinning it dead rigid. Wood that fails almost never failed because it was wood. It failed because it got trapped wet against metal that rusted in a joint that was never allowed to move. Be honest with yourself about the trade-offs too. The full method costs real skilled labour and time. You will most likely need a structural engineer to sign off on it, and exposed heavy timber is not the right answer for every site or every load. Those are fair limits. The same way poured concrete is sometimes simply the right call. But done properly, you end up holding the one part of a building you could hand down to your grandchildren without a second thought. A wooden peg does not rust. A joint that tightens itself does not need fixing. Which brings us right back to that barn out in the countryside, the one that has stood for 700 years without a single nail in it. Nothing about it is holding on by brute force. The pegs are still doing their slow, patient work. The wood is still locked to wood, and the frame is still quietly ignoring the centuries the way it always has. The knowledge was never destroyed. It is sitting right there in those joints, in plain sight, waiting for anyone who actually bothers to look. If you want to be there for the next piece of buried craft we dig back up, subscribe, and you will not miss it.